I recently discovered a dark family secret that was hidden from me my entire life. Now I don't know who I can trust. I never imagined that my life would end up this way. Growing up, I had always looked up to my brother, Jacob. He was the charismatic one, the one who had a way with people, while I was the quieter, more reserved sibling. Our parents loved us both, though I always sensed they were more lenient with him, perhaps because he had a knack for getting into trouble. But as we grew older, the cracks in our relationship began to deepen until they eventually tore us apart completely. I guess I should have seen it coming. Jacob had always had a way of manipulating people, of turning situations to his advantage. He had been the golden child for most of our childhood, even though he had a habit of making poor decisions. But none of those decisions had ever affected me personally, at least not until he crossed the one line I thought no one would ever cross. He betrayed me in the most intimate and devastating way possible. It started about 5 years ago, when my wife, Sarah, and I had been married for only 3 years. Sarah and I had been high school sweethearts, and our relationship had always been strong. We supported each other through thick and thin, and she had been my rock when my career had hit a rough patch. I thought we were solid, but Jacob, my brother, my own flesh and blood, had found a way to worm himself into our marriage and tear it apart. Jacob had always been around. He and Sarah got along well, maybe too well, but I never suspected anything. In fact, I was glad that my wife and brother had a good relationship. I figured it was a sign that our families were close-knit. I encouraged it, even invited Jacob to stay over at our house during the weekends when he was going through a rough patch financially. He needed a place to stay, and we had the space. It seemed like the right thing to do. I had no idea that I was inviting disaster into my home. For months, I had no clue what was happening right under my nose. I was busy with work, often staying late at the office in an effort to climb the corporate ladder. Sarah was supportive of my career ambitions, or at least she seemed to be. She told me she understood, and that she was proud of me for working so hard. But looking back, I realize now that she was lonely. She needed attention, and when I wasn't there to give it to her, Jacob was. I don't know when it started exactly, whether it was just a moment of weakness between them or something they had been planning all along. What I do know is that for nearly a year, they carried on their affair behind my back. It wasn't just a fling either. It was a full-blown relationship hidden in plain sight. There were clues, of course, hints that I missed or ignored because I trusted both of them completely. There were nights when Jacob and Sarah would stay up late talking after I had gone to bed. I didn't think much of it at the time. Jacob was going through some personal issues, and Sarah was always kind-hearted, the type of person who wanted to help. I figured she was just being a good sister-in-law. Little did I know, those late-night talks were more than just conversations. It wasn't until Sarah became pregnant that everything came crashing down. We had been trying for a baby for over a year, and when she told me she was finally pregnant, I was overjoyed. I felt like our lives were coming together in the perfect way. We were finally going to have the family we had always dreamed of. But something wasn't right. As the months went on, Sarah became distant. She wouldn't look me in the eye, and there was a tension between us that I couldn't explain. I chalked it up to pregnancy hormones, the stress of preparing for a baby. But deep down, I think I knew something was wrong. The day I found out the truth will forever be etched in my memory. It was a Saturday afternoon. Sarah was out shopping for baby clothes, and Jacob was at work, or so I thought. I was cleaning out the attic when I came across an old box of Jacob's things. He had left some of his personal items at our house when he had moved out a few months earlier, and I figured I'd finally go through them and see what needed to be tossed. At the bottom of the box, I found a notebook. It looked like a journal, something I had never known Jacob to keep. Out of curiosity, I flipped through the pages, skimming over what seemed to be random thoughts and notes. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. There, written in Jacob's handwriting, was a confession of love for Sarah. Page after page, he detailed his feelings for her, how their affair had started, and how they had tried to keep it a secret. He wrote about the guilt he felt, but also about how he couldn't stop himself from loving her. And then, on one of the last pages, he wrote something that shattered my world. The baby might be mine. I dropped the notebook and felt my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be true. There was no way. Sarah and I had been trying for a baby for so long, and now the child she was carrying might not even be mine? I confronted Sarah as soon as she came home. She looked terrified, like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't even have to ask her. The guilt was written all over her face. She broke down, sobbing, and confessed everything. The affair, the lies, the possibility that the baby wasn't mine. I was devastated. I couldn't even look at her. I walked out of the house and drove aimlessly for hours, trying to wrap my head around what I had just learned. For weeks, I couldn't speak to Sarah. I couldn't stand to be in the same room as her, knowing what she had done. But the worst part was the uncertainty. I needed to know the truth. I needed to know if the child she was carrying was mine or Jacob's. We scheduled a paternity test as soon as it was possible. The wait for the results was agonizing. Every day felt like a year, and I could barely function at work or in my personal life. I felt like my entire world had collapsed, and I didn't know if I would ever be able to rebuild it. When the results finally came in, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The baby wasn't mine. It was Jacob's. My own brother had not only betrayed me by sleeping with my wife, but he had fathered a child with her. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I wanted to confront him, to scream at him, to hurt him the way he had hurt me. But instead, I did something I never thought I'd do. I cut them both out of my life. I filed for divorce from Sarah the very next day. She begged me to reconsider, to work things out for the sake of the child. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was betrayal. She had shattered the trust we had built over the years, and I knew I could never forgive her. As for Jacob, I didn't even bother speaking to him. He had moved out of town by then, likely too ashamed to face me. Our parents were devastated when they found out what had happened. They had always favored Jacob, but even they couldn't excuse his actions this time. For the first time in his life, they held him accountable. They cut him off financially, disowned him, and told him they wanted nothing to do with him. It was a harsh punishment, but one that was long overdue. A year after the dust had settled, our parents passed away in a car accident. It was sudden and tragic, and despite everything, I was heartbroken. They had been good parents, even if they had been too lenient with Jacob. I had hoped that in time, we might have been able to rebuild our family, but now that chance was gone. When the will was read, I was shocked to learn that my parents had left everything to me, every cent of their $2 million estate. Jacob, the golden child, had been left with nothing. I didn't ask for it, and I certainly didn't feel like I deserved it. But there it was, a final message from my parents. They had chosen me in the end. Not long after the inheritance was finalized, I received a phone call from Jacob. It was the first time I had heard from him in years. He was desperate. He had hit rock bottom, and now that our parents were gone, he had no one to turn to. He begged me for help, for some of the money our parents had left me. He said he needed it to support his child, the child he had with my ex-wife. I couldn't believe the nerve of him. After everything he had done, after the way he had betrayed me, he had the audacity to ask for my help. Part of me wanted to hang up the phone and never speak to him again. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the bond we once had as brothers, hesitated. Should I help him? Should I turn my back on him the way he had turned his back on me? I sat there for a long time, listening to Jacob's voice on the other end of the line, pleading for help. He was trying to explain how hard things had been for him since our parents cut him off. He painted a picture of financial ruin, of struggles with jobs, bills piling up, and worst of all, the pressure of raising a child he couldn't fully support. The child he had with Sarah, my ex-wife. The audacity of his request made me sick. He had ruined my marriage, broken our family apart, and now he wanted my sympathy? My help? How do you even have the nerve to ask me for anything after what you did? I asked, my voice trembling with anger. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and hearing his voice again brought back all the rage, the pain, the betrayal. I know I don't deserve anything from you, Jacob replied, his voice cracking. But I've got nothing left, man. You know me, I never was good with money, and with Mom and Dad gone, Don't bring them into this, I snapped. They disowned you, Jacob. They cut you out of their lives for a reason." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear him breathing, trying to think of the right words. I didn't want to hear his excuses. I didn't want to hear anything from him, but part of me couldn't bring myself to hang up. Maybe it was the sense of finality I needed to feel, hearing him beg, hearing the consequences of his actions weigh down on him like they should have years ago. "You're right," he finally said. "I screwed up. I ruined everything, and I have to live with that every day. But this isn't about me. It's about my son. He's innocent in all this. He didn't ask for any of this." I clenched my fists. His son, the child that should have been mine, but instead was the product of his affair with my wife. I hadn't seen Sarah or the boy since the divorce was finalized. I had moved to another city, started over, tried to build a life without the shadow of their betrayal hanging over me. But now, Jacob was trying to drag me back into it. "It's not my problem, Jacob," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You made your choices. You and Sarah made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." "I'm not asking for much," Jacob said, his voice desperate now. "Just enough to get me back on my feet, for my son's sake. Please, he's your nephew, after all." The mention of the boy being my nephew hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't my nephew, not to me. He was a painful reminder of everything that had been stolen from me. My marriage, my future, my trust in the people closest to me. "I don't owe you anything," I said, my anger rising again. "You destroyed my life, and now you're asking me to help you? To help raise the child that came from your betrayal?" Jacob was silent for a moment. I could tell he was struggling to find the right thing to say, to make me feel some kind of guilt or sympathy. But I felt nothing for him anymore. That bond of brotherhood we once had, it had been severed, and I had no intention of ever mending it. "Please," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. "I've got no one else." "That's not my problem." I ended the call. After hanging up, I sat there for a while, my mind racing. My parents had left me everything: the house, the investments, the $2 million that Jacob had once assumed would be his. He had been the favored son for most of our lives, the one they had always bailed out of trouble. But in the end, it was me they trusted. They had seen through his charm, his manipulation, and they had chosen to leave him with nothing. But did that mean I was obligated to give him something? Did having the money mean I had to play the role of savior, even for someone who had betrayed me so completely? For weeks after that call, I wrestled with the decision. I wanted to move forward with my life, to leave the past behind, but it seemed like Jacob's shadow still loomed over everything. The inheritance that had seemed like a gift at first now felt like a burden. Every dollar reminded me of the tangled mess that was our family's history, of the pain that still lingered beneath the surface. I consulted with a few close friends, the only people who knew the full story. Some told me to give Jacob nothing, to cut him out for good, and let him deal with the consequences of his actions. Others said that, despite everything, I should help him for the sake of the child, my so-called nephew, who didn't deserve to suffer for the sins of his parents. I wasn't sure what to do. The anger still burned inside me, but at the same time, I didn't want to carry the weight of that anger for the rest of my life. I had worked hard to rebuild after the divorce, to move past the betrayal and find some measure of peace. Helping Jacob, even a little, felt like reopening old wounds that had barely begun to heal. In the end, I made a decision that I knew would surprise some people. I didn't give Jacob the money, not directly anyway, but I did something I thought was fair, something that would allow me to walk away without feeling guilty. I set up a trust fund for the child, Jacob's son. The trust would be in the boy's name, and he would have access to it when he turned 18. The money would be managed by a third party, and neither Jacob nor Sarah would ever touch it. I made sure of that. It wasn't much, just enough to help the boy if he ever needed it in the future, for school or other expenses. But it wasn't for Jacob. It was never for Jacob. When I told Jacob what I had done, he was furious. He called me, screaming about how it wasn't enough, how he needed money now, how unfair it was that I was holding all the cards while he had nothing. But I didn't care. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to change my mind. I told him this was the last time we would speak. that I was done with him, done with the lies, the manipulation, the betrayal. I had my life to live and he had his. He made his choices, and now he had to live with them. That was the last time I ever spoke to Jacob. I don't know what became of him after that, whether he was able to pull himself together or if he continued to spiral down the path of self-destruction. I don't care. I've moved on with my life, and I've learned to let go of the anger, the bitterness that once consumed me. As for the inheritance, I used it to build a future for myself, one free from the toxic family dynamics that had once controlled my life. I invested wisely, started my own business, and found happiness again in ways I never thought possible. I built relationships with people I could trust, people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. And the trust fund for Jacob's son? I haven't thought much about it since. Maybe one day, when he's older, he'll reach out to me. Maybe he won't. Either way, I did what I could for the child, and that's all that matters to me. Because in the end, I learned something valuable from all this. Family isn't just about blood. It's about trust, loyalty, and respect. And once those things are broken, sometimes the only way to move forward is to walk away, no matter how hard it might be.